My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we've got a bone to pick with the Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow.
Our first segment is the basic crawl.
The Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow is a 4-page, if you count the cover, Crystal Frontier mini-adventure for levels 1 to 3, created by Gus L., with editing by Nick Whelan, Eric Boyd, and Ramanan S. And the contents are as follows. First, we have a very brief intro to the general setting, which is Pickbone Mound. And there we find Marble Eye's hide hut. Marble Eye has eyes of polished stone, and he knows a way into the tomb. There is also an empty tomb, a feast hall putrefied by time, a false tomb, and the Guardian Path, where you will find animated statues. Beyond that is the segment entitled Sigils, Beast and Altar, and this really is the crux of the matter. To quote the text, "This is Rolling Calf, an undead assassin of the Warlock King, raised from the corpse of one of his demon-cursed Auroch guard to kill wizards. The sigils keep him imprisoned, at least for now. Slightly beyond him is the Warlord's tomb, perhaps the location of what you seek, and then we conclude with some concluding notes." So, let's talk about how we've used this in our games. I have only read it. Jason, how about you?
I have run it as a one-shot using Trophy Gold.
All right, which is normally one shot between us might not be enough, but it's small, so it's okay.
It's an incredibly short dungeon. Yeah. It should be okay. Let's talk about things we liked. How about just surface level stuff to start?
Yeah, sure. So the art and the colour scheme is this sort of quite vivid but dark palette of slightly greyish green and a deep burgundy, which I find very striking and eye-catching, although I'm acutely aware that I think I would start to find it hard to read if the adventure were any longer than maybe another 4 pages, let's say. What do you think?
I tend to agree. I also like the color scheme. I think red and green always look good together. One thing that I think is worth pointing out is that the choice of red especially seems to be very intentional, not just because it looked nice, but because there are certain elements of the dungeon where the color red features quite prominently. The wizard/witch Marble Eye, they're described as having like a carnelian necklace. The marbles that are their eyes are like these polished red stones, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. There's blood features prominently in the story, like the way you use blood to like access different parts of the dungeon. So I think that the red choice was also a thematic choice as far as the graphics go. I agree though that it's striking, but it probably would be a bit much if it was like much longer. So yeah, but it's good for what it is.
Yeah.
What else did you like about it?
The overarching good thing about it is in a way its simplicity. So for example, the opening gives you just a good simple adventure hook for getting into wanting to go into this tomb, which is, let me see, this is Marble Eye, of course. He is an expert in curses and known to cure tomb crystal poisoning for a price. So, just poison 1 PC or 2 to be safe and job done. Send them off to this guy and your adventure begins. And I think that kind of is true of the whole dungeon, the whole adventure. Like, there's a tendency to want to cram everything if you're doing a 1 or 2 page dungeon into the space. But actually, you need to give enough room to breathe and to realise that actually a role-playing session quite often doesn't burn through that much material that quickly. Do you know what I mean? It feels about the right size for... Well, you did a one-shot, so I guess for 1 session, but probably for 2.
It's perfectly sized for 1 shot.
Yeah.
I ran it in Trophy Gold. On the one hand, Trophy Gold, because of the hunt roll token economy, because that allows you to, if you want, like essentially skip certain parts of the dungeon or at least like summarize or fast forward through them, that actually would indicate that maybe the dungeon is a little bit longer than a one-shot, because we did use that hunt roll token sort of fast forwarding technique at one point in the dungeon, which probably made it a little shorter. But that was counterbalanced by the fact that our scene with the witch and trying to get access to the dungeon was maybe a little bit longer than it would have been in normal OSR play, because the characters were very focused on finding alternative ways into the dungeon, because the way you're supposed to do it is basically the witch tells you, like, you have to go sacrifice this pig, spill its blood on the altar, and then that opens up this like false bottom to the altar, which leads to a shaft that goes down to the dungeon. And our characters were kind of like focused on trying to find other ways of doing it.
Yeah.
Also, just because of the way Trophy works, there tends to be like a lot more just added fiction from the players that I think you probably normally get. So it all kind of like just evened out. I think about one shot is what it is. It's perfectly sized for one session. I have to imagine that's what Gus had in mind.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's notable that the title says Barrow. Now, the thing about barrows, of course, is that that's your sort of Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, ancient tomb, and they tend to be pretty simple. They're like a tunnel into a hill with maybe one or two chambers in it. And this, I mean, I don't think it follows the classical rules for a barrow. Archaeology-based listeners, please write in. But it feels like it's not a labyrinth. It does feel like not historically accurate, but it feels like a believable tomb to me.
Yeah, I felt that way too. There's one particular part when you first get to the actual like tomb part of it. It's like this feast hall, and the feast hall has these, the way it's described, it's very clearly meant to be a remembrance of this like warlord that used to rule the land. I mean, it's almost like a diorama because it's got these scenes of the past on the walls. It's got this like feasting table. There's a chariot in one corner, which
right.
we assume, was like a great artifact of whoever's buried here. As soon as you get there, you have this feeling of like, okay, this is a burial mound. Like, this is what it is. Like, it's here to be that. So yeah, I think that was conveyed really nicely. That kind of dovetails nicely with one of the things that I wanted to say, which is this is a short dungeon. It's a compact dungeon, but it doesn't feel shallow at all. Like you mentioned, the way that the tomb is presented feels very believable, but also if you move the timeline forward to when Marble Eyes and this undead assassin, the Rolling Calf, when they show up, that storyline is layered in nicely with the existing tomb, and it's simple, but it's not simplistic.
Right,
it's an easy setup, but it feels very complex. It's a bit of a factional puzzle you have to sort out, because what happened is this undead assassin creature is chased Marble Eyes to this place, and Marble Eyes essentially tricked them and trapped them with these sigils. But now, in order to stay alive, Marble Eyes has to stay there at the burial mound and periodically refresh the sigils by spilling this blood on them.
He's accidentally imprisoned himself, hasn't he? Which is
right. Yeah, he's imprisoned
good.
himself. Yeah. Exactly. When the players start to sort of unlock this and start to figure out like what the story is, it's suddenly not such an easy thing, because the players have to question, like, if we try to get past the trapped creature will now be free to do whatever it's going to do. Like, you could just find yourself taking sides really, or be kind of pulled this way or that between like which faction you want to like side up with, essentially. And it's a short dungeon, but it's got a punch.
Yeah, that's given this new depth for me, because I already thought that the wizard was he seemed like a wonderful character to play as the GM, probably, right? He seems a bit Weasley, maybe a little bit unwashed and fragile, but also dangerous. He's got an insane death curse thing he can do.
Yeah.
But the fact that he's also a victim of irony and has a quite good reason for living a hermit-like existence in the middle of nowhere, which is that he literally can't leave.
Yeah.
He's down to his last pig as well, I think, which is, more bargaining leverage.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
It's good. And another thing that I liked about this, and another reason why this very compact dungeon has quite a lot of depth, is there's a really beautiful symmetry throughout the whole thing. I think these sort of like trapped assassin and the trapped mage is a good one, right? Which I hadn't even really considered till just this conversation right now. But also, at one point, there is a stone statue with a spear, and the statue is not animated, it's just a statue. But later on, there are these stone statues that actually come alive and attack you. The spear is cursed, but later on, you can find like the valuable spear. It's got like several little moments. Oh, the spilling of the blood. Like, you have to spill the blood topside to get into the tomb, but then you have to also spill the blood in order to refresh the ritual, right? So it's just got these nice like little echoes, little bookends, like symmetry. It works really great.
Yeah, that's great. I had the spears in my notes as well, because it's described, one is a gleaming copper spear and the other one is a shining bronze spear. And, one's that could be the treasure you came to get, and the other one is cursed. And does one seem a little bit too easy? It's a tricky decision to make in character, whether to pick up this spear or not. And it feels to me like real-life tomb decoys would. In like ancient Egyptian tombs is the classic. But I think most civilizations where people have been opulently buried have done that thing, like in...
right, yeah.
Stick the cheap fake stuff over where it's easier to find. I don't know why the spears appeal to me so much. I guess because they're like the only maybe gleaming metal thing in the dungeon. They stand out that way, so that, I don't know. Something about that caught my imagination, yeah.
You've kind of nailed something there with the sort of historical parallels of the way that actual, like, historical tombs were set up. There are these decoy things. This aspect of the dungeon is one of the things that makes it feel much more realistic. I also think it's one of the things that ties it back into a very famous OSR dungeon that I think was a big influence on this is Tomb of the Serpent Kings, which we've covered in a previous episode. Because Tomb of the Serpent Kings has this whole idea of the false tomb and the true tomb. And the Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow, interestingly, also presents itself as a teaching dungeon, like Tomb of the Serpent Kings is a teaching dungeon. So basically, like, fully half the text in Bruja is given over to, if Tomb of the Serpent Kings is like Dungeoneering 101, this is like Dungeoneering 102 or 201, right? Like, it's like the next phase. It kind of like deepens it. And so I think that Gus was probably clearly like making nods to Tomb of the Serpent Kings and also nods to actual history. It all just kind of comes together to make this dungeon much more than what it appears to be on paper.
Yeah, for sure.
Anything else you want to say about it?
I do like the way it's sort of set up to create, as it notes in the text, to create further complications and things that will happen in your next session as well. But I think we're going to talk about that more in the Expert Delve. So let's just, as the saying goes, stick a pin in it.
Things we had questions about.
Sure, let me see. I have one structural question, which is, how do we feel about that empty tomb bottleneck, which is that there is, as written, one way into the rest of the dungeon from the surface? And the only person who knows the way in, per se, is Marble Eye, the wizard. If I were running this and the players were to quote-unquote mess up and, like, I don't know, get into a fight with him and kill the one guy who knows the way in, I'd let them figure it out, right? But it would be like, when you're playing an Infocom text adventure and you use all the help files. You wouldn't feel as satisfied. So personally, I tend to prefer, and by the way, spoilers coming up for the Chained Coffin, everyone, where there's like an obvious but undesirable entrance in. Like, there's the main gate, but it's dangerous or unpleasant in some way.
Right.
And if you get the puzzle part right, then you get the easy way in. But there's no real harm done if you don't find it. I guess the simple answer here is to add a difficult way in as well, which might just be digging downwards. But
right, yeah.
I don't know. Am I overthinking that? Maybe I am. It's quite a simple dungeon.
I tend to agree. This sort of like singular entrance is probably especially hard in more traditional OSR play. It wasn't as big a deal in Trophy.
Yeah, fair enough. Although, I mean, as we're saying, it is quite a small scenario. And the other thing is players tend to find solutions when they've destroyed the actual answer. So
ultimately, they're going to get in. I mean, even in a more traditional game, they're going to find a way in.
Yeah,
even if you said like they have to like dig.
Yeah, eventually they're going to go back to town, hire 20 stout labourers and come back with shovels.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yes.
Anyway,
exactly.
Did you have any questions or doubts? Yeah.
I do. Mine is more of a philosophical question, and maybe one that we've been kind of answering the whole time we've been producing this show, which is, how important is it to experience the dungeon in the way that the author intended? And I ask this because Gus, the author of Bruja, watched our playthrough on YouTube, and he commented that he found it was really interesting that Trophy Gold does kind of short circuit, or you can short circuit certain aspects of the dungeon, particular ones that have to do with navigating physical space. Apparently, I mean, I knew this from a read, and I know this is a philosophical thing in the OSR, but like the actual like geographical navigational aspect of the dungeon, the spatial aspect of the dungeon is really important. But like we disregard it in Trophy. Like we don't care about this 50 feet this way and 100 feet that way. So that's just the way we play. We got talking and we both like settled on the idea that the players still got the Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow experience. It was just in a different way. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on how important is that, the author's intentionality in terms of like how to experience it to you.
In a way, you're asking precisely the wrong person, because I tend to try and design scenarios so that if I'm running them, they surprise me. I try and design elements that will interact in unpredictable ways. I don't know. I guess to give a sort of boring but correct answer. I think it's important if that's what you're setting out to do. So I finished a while ago running through the Enemy Within campaign for Warhammer. We played it kind of rules as written and everything. We didn't faff around with changing anything, even if we were tempted to, because we wanted to try and experience it as intended.
Right.
But having said that, role-playing adventures are such a contingent medium that there's only a certain degree to which you can do that. And even if you were OSRing it up, playing, let's say, BX, and doing all the movement things, maybe your interpretation of how to play Rolling Calf is completely different.
Right.
And to what Gus L imagines, maybe Gus L plays him like Alan Rickman, as opposed to you, who, of course, plays all your villains like Michael J. Fox.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
That I think is really interesting, but I do think it's interesting to try and recreate what the designer was thinking of. And I think you can always get that feeling of what's important in a module, even though you've shortcutted, say, the literal distances involved. I still think, from the sounds of it, that your Trophy Gold adventure was quite a lot about navigating physical space, even though some of it was climbing upside down using magic, right? That was definitely a thing that you were doing. Also, I have noticed as well that, there are certain games where you can make, for example, crossing a river and making a rope bridge. You can spend an hour doing that in a game, and sometimes it's really interesting. And other times you're just, okay, roll to make a rope thing to cross the river. We're done. We're doing something else. This is a terrible cop-out answer, but I think it really varies depending on what, not just like, oh, my group likes this category of adventures and not this category. It's really what you feel like in the moment and how you as a group gauge what you're going to do next. Because if one player is interested in something, they will drag the group in that direction. I really think you have to just cross the river by feeling the stones, as they say.
Yeah,
in that matter.
The striking moment for us when we went through this module is, so at one point in the dungeon, there's this like twisty, unworked cavern tunnel where there are these 3 guardian statues set at different intervals. And there's a bit of a puzzle there, because the puzzle is, if they have these like opal eyes, the statues do, and when they see you, they light up, and when they light up, it indicates that they are active, they're ready to attack. And the way you get past them is by, you can fight them, or you can just try to make it to where they can't see you. And this was where the players in my group decided to spend their hunt roll tokens in order to bypass it. Their characters still did it, but we just didn't really like dwell on it or do any rolls or anything. So they didn't like have to fight the statues or do some tests to figure out if they could sneak by. But what they did do instead is, because they spent the hunt roll tokens in Trophy Gold, I'm obligated to tell them like how they're getting past this. I kind of take over the fiction a little bit. But then I turned it over to them to really like fill in the details. And so even though they were automatically getting past the statues, and even though I told them how to get past them, like you have to cover their eyes up or otherwise fight them, what the players did is they dived in there and they started like just giving us some fiction. Ooh, for this statue I do this, and for this statue I do that. And then I go into my pack and I pull this out and I do this. And so we got like the feeling of it. We just didn't dwell on the role playing of it. We got the story, but we just didn't like do all the die rolls and stuff.
And I think the danger there is that sounds like, oh, that's always what I want. I always just want to get on with it, but get the feeling. But there is another sensation, which is that, I'm going to call it slightly dry. That sounds negative, but it's not. The thing like when you're playing Classic Traveller, like, and after a while, you get good as a crew at doing things like calculating, like figuring out how much fuel you're going to need. And like you're sort of doing stuff like jumping to new planets and getting everything right. And you're like, this is cool. We're getting good at doing stuff. This is awesome. Right. There's a real sense of accomplishment. So that's what you miss out on. But it's such a different kind of fun. I don't think you feel the loss of it when you're doing the cool sneaking montage stuff. That's
right.
It's
when you do it in
game,
montage,
right?
It's just a different approach. And just to be clear for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with Trophy Gold, mechanically and in terms of like the danger level, this was a big decision for the group to spend the tokens at this moment, because you have a limited number of these tokens that you can find, and you either have to spend them on treasure, which you desperately need before you return to town, or otherwise your character is retired from play, or you have to save them up and spend them at key moments. And so they chose to spend them at that moment, thereby bypassing treasure, but also not having them for the very next encounter, which is the like scary undead demon cow-headed creature encounter. So they suddenly didn't have that to rely on. So there's like a risk reward thing. That's like the sort of gameplay of Trophy Gold. And so I just want to kind of point that out so that listeners don't think it's just a hand-wavy storytime game or whatever. Let's go to the Chain Lightning round. Kick us off, Tom.
Okay. Rolling Calf, and I quote, can never be an ally, and his master is a callous despot whose thanks are limited to unpleasant orders and demands.
I like this description of Pickbone Mound. Stripped by wind and time, walls of dry cyclopean stone mark the Barrow's outline in the waste. Not even the ubiquitous lichen grows for hundreds of yards around the Barrow, and those attuned to magic sense an ominous power beneath the earth, stinking of old blood and sour wine.
Marble Eye is filthy, thin, and has eyes of polished stone. He wears the blood robes fashionable at the Warlock King's court.
I like this description of the warlord's tomb, surrounded by an armory of time-eaten bronze and 10,000 candles of curdled red wax. The withered mummy of a huge, red-bearded man rests in an open tomb, clutching a shining bronze spear with a red-stained shaft.
Another one on Rolling Calf for me, which is that Rolling Calf will make other promises, but will deliver nothing more, claiming that survival and the Witch King's forbearance are a greater gift.
Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. So, the Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow is a very short module, and in the past, we've talked about how to whittle down a very long module to make it fit the amount of time you have to play. I think we covered that in the Deep Carbon Observatory episode, which is a very, very long module. I wanted to sort of talk about the reverse of that, which is how can you build on a small dungeon, on a small module, to either take up more time or to just maybe give it a little more heft. If you think about some of those like one-page dungeon contest entries, those are pretty cool for what they are, but they don't have a lot of like context around them. They're kind of very, very simple sorts of things. And so I thought it might be fun to sort of just talk about like expanding the module, like ways you can do it, simple ways to sort of just like beef them up a little bit. And I frequently run sessions in 2 shots. I like a 2-shot just so I have plenty of time to do everything I want to do. But sometimes a 2-shot is too much time for just a very tiny dungeon, right? I don't think, for example, that the Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow, as written, would have worked well in a 2-shot without something extra. Mm-hmm. I did it in a 1-shot because I knew that. But if I wanted to, there were some things I could have done to sort of expand it and make it fill that time a little better. So what do you think about the sort of premise of our discussion here?
This is good stuff, especially because it's a common scenario. Having a thing that you think is not, well, firstly, that doesn't expand to fill the amount of time that you want it to fill. And also, if you want to have something be part of a series, sometimes you want to have these ligatures. But and I don't mean necessarily like an ongoing campaign, but like I tend to do things where my adventures are not all set in the same place, but they feel like they're thematically linked, or they might all be in the same universe or something. So I like to kind of have some recurring elements and stuff like that, where it's just useful. It's maybe one of our less artistic and more craftsman-like sessions is what I'm trying to say.
Indeed. Well, so I consider this to be something of a area of expertise for me because I am accustomed to running games in a way where we have a limited amount of time to do everything we want to do. I don't do typically great big long campaigns. I do like short series or I do 1-shots. And so I often have to think about ways of fleshing things out a little bit so that the experience feels a little more full for the group, or because I have time to fill. Mm-hmm. I think something that I like to do is when I have like a very, very small dungeon or small adventure and I want to just stretch it out to a second session or maybe a third session, or I want to add some meat to the bone, I have a couple of things that I do that I think do this really great and are very simple. The first is on the front end, you can add a very simple traveling to the dungeon encounter. This is something that exists outside of the text of the dungeon. It's just like a monster encounter, a bandit encounter, just something that you just put in front of the player characters to get their, it kind of gets them a little like warmed up, and it importantly kind of fills the time.
Yeah.
I used to do this all the time when I was running Dungeon World back in the day. And back then, like, say 3 or 4 years ago, I just would just grab some random ass monster, right? I'd be like, okay,
yep,
centipedes that burst out of the ground and Ankeg. We'll do some Ankegs or we'll do some bandits or whatever, right? It had no real connection to what was going to happen in the dungeon. And that worked fine. But kind of from doing this show and from working on the trophy role-playing game a lot, I have become much more tuned to the idea of theme. Mm-hmm. And so now what I do is I make sure that initial pre-encounter is themed really closely to what's going to happen, or at least there's some element that like is thematically connected. But this is a good little type of encounter because the players kind of know, especially if you tell them, and I sometimes do tell them, they know that like this isn't the main adventure, and they kind of know that it's not the main adventure, and Jason is not going to like destroy us right now. Right?
The good thing about Trophy Gold is you can't.
Right.
But that lost hit point might kill them later, so it's perfect.
Yeah. Precisely, yeah. It's especially good in Trophy Gold. But like,
anyway.
It's just like an encounter that like gives the characters a chance to show off a little bit, takes up some time, fleshes out the dungeon on the front end, and that's great. It can also be a way of expanding on things that happen in the dungeon too, because sometimes things come up in this like initial little like pre-encounter or this sort of like early encounter that ends up being like rich material for later that you can reincorporate later. So you always want to kind of pay attention and see if there's something you can kind of use, which can further flesh out your very tiny dungeon. The other thing I'll do is on the back end, I'll do epilogues. So if this is a closed game, we're just doing like a 2-shot small dungeon, I'll add an epilogue period at the end so that it takes up a little bit of time, but it also like enriches the whole experience for everyone. We've talked about epilogues before on the show, but essentially it's a chance for the players to kind of show what happens to their character at the end of the story and make sure that the players are keeping everything focused on their own character. Don't let them narrate epilogues that drag others into it unless they get their permission.
Yeah, raise the question about like what's your character doing at X point.
Precisely, yeah. Another thing you can do with the epilogues is if you did lose a character, you can have the player show how the world around them is changed because that character is no longer there, right? In their absence, what does the world look like? That's another thing you can do with the epilogue. But these two things together, this sort of like traveling to the dungeon encounter at the front end and epilogues at the back end, just those two simple additions easily changes a tiny 1-shot dungeon into a 2-shot, no problem. Because the way it usually goes is session 1 will be character creation, introducing characters. Then you have your little traveling to the dungeon encounter, and then you do the first few chambers of the dungeon. And then session 2, you finish the dungeon, and then you do epilogues and a debrief. It's a perfect way to size up a small dungeon.
Yeah, no, I'm very into this, especially, first of all, let me say epilogues are king. I always or nearly always do epilogues, sometimes after adventure conclusions when a campaign's still going to happen. We talked about expanding to fill time, but actually, just in terms of expanding content to make things better, I think you should try and do epilogues when you can. I have some structural reasons for this as well as it just being good character stuff and role-playing. Also, the on the way to the dungeon encounter, this is also good, for building theme. I also like to do the Graham Walmsley Cthulhu adventure thing of having people warn them not to go there, right? Because that...
Right,
if it's a scary horror adventure, then it's scarier. If they're badass heroes or kung fu warriors, it just makes them look more badass that they ignore these warnings. But one of the issues with the on-the-way encounter, because I tend to try and do things that could be a fight or could just be a talky scene. And our fights are easy to tell when they're finished. They conclude neatly. But more social encounters don't. So you've got to have in your mind a way to make this scene stop so it doesn't take up too much time in that opening segment. And this is also related to what epilogues are good for. I don't know about you. Sometimes when I get to the end of a dungeon, there's just sort of this bit where it's just kind of waning, and you're like, well, I guess we finished the adventure then, guys. Thanks for what are you doing later? So no, if at that point you start going, okay, let's do epilogues, and then my normal thing is I say, like, I ask the first person what their character would be doing a week from now, and then I have a month, and then the next person gets a year, next person gets 10 years, and that feels cool and like expansive to do,
You're right. This is particularly the case for a dungeon that is like sized to be a 1-shot or like a little tiny experience. They don't usually have a lot of like stuff to do at the end, right?
No, and there's something about epilogues that brings out everyone's creativity really well as well. Like you get these tremendously poignant story conclusions for characters that, to be honest, you barely know as like 4 hit point wizard. Well,
right. Yeah. I have a theory about that actually as a little side note here. My theory on that is that it's because it's low stakes storytelling.
You're safe now, right?
Yeah, I think it's the reason why the thing I described in the earlier segment about like how the characters really got into describing how they got past those statues. it's the same idea. They know they're not going to get killed, right?
Yeah.
They get to like be as creative as they want
Yeah,
and like describing how things happen.
And even if you did, there's only 20 minutes left of the session. Doesn't matter,
Precisely.
So, yeah.
I do love the idea of the GM who TPKs everyone after the dungeon is over. That would be
that'd be great. I did do that. What was I running? It's something we had.
Oh my god, I was just joking.
No, statues. We had a TPK. There's some poison stuff in the. Oh, watch out. Anyway,
Watch out, indeed.
It is possible.
So, okay, let's expand on this idea a little bit. Because what I've mostly described so far is just like the way to take a one-shot dungeon and turn it into a two-shot. I think that you can do some other things to change a one-shot or a small dungeon or a small module. There's some things you can do to like flesh it out for just the sake of making the story deeper and more interesting. I like to do this technique I've talked about before called an establishing question. I will sometimes ask an establishing question near the beginning of the adventure, and then I will pay attention to ways to incorporate the answer to that question into the actual upcoming dungeon. So an example of an establishing question might be, you have heard rumors of a powerful treasure hidden in the tomb beneath Pickbone Mound. What is it and why do you need it? Now, this is not something that the module foresees, right? This is something I'm asking outside of the valence of the module. But the players are going to tell me the answer, and then I have a chance to sort of say, okay, here's something that the players are interested in. How can I add it to my tiny dungeon? Right?
Yeah.
Maybe you just you create a new room or a new encounter, or you change something about one of the factions in the dungeon to sort of make it more focused on that item.
Or you do what I normally do, which is you completely forget until later on they're in some treasure room going, is there a mace around here? And you're like, oh yeah, he was looking for some magic mace.
There is!
Yeah, there is, yeah.
And then they're all like, whoa.
Oh, amazing. What a master storyteller, yeah.
But in all seriousness, though, it makes for a rich experience. It makes for an experience the players are invested in. And for purposes of our discussion today, it also, fleshes out this dungeon.
That's right, yeah. It makes it more hooked into the characters. Actually, the what are you looking for and why do you need it? One quite good thing you can do, especially if it's a one-shot with an open table where maybe you don't know the players so well, is to give more thinking time by just saying, what is it you're looking for? And then the second part of the question comes in that opening on the way scene where they meet the skeptical peasant, oh, going up to Pitchbone Mound, are you? What are you looking for? And they say, oh, we're looking for the Mace of Dubiousness. And then he says, why? And by that time, they've had time to figure out why they would possibly want it.
Right.
And then they get to do a bit of in-character chat as well, which sometimes is, again, with newer players, this is a nice chance for them to explain their motivations. So, yeah, that's...
absolutely.
So, yeah, what do you want and why is that maybe the best establishing question? I think it must be, right?
For a fantasy adventure game, I think it is, yeah. I mean, it's straightforward and it's connected to what you're going to be doing, right? It would be weird if, you asked a question, what do you think about the architectural motivations of barrow making or whatever, in the ancient world? That doesn't make any sense, right? No one gives a shit, right?
Yeah.
Ask something related to what they're doing. Another thing you can do to sort of flesh out a sort of sparse dungeon is consider some things that the factions in the dungeon might want. Now, some modules actually put this advice at the end of the module in the part where they talk about continuing the adventure. They'll say oh, the cult of the purple hand wants this, so maybe this is happening at the end or whatever, right? There's no reason why you can't take some of that existing information and sort of incorporate it earlier. It takes a little bit of creativity, but you can do it. One of the things I like about taking an existing module and fleshing it out by thinking of what the factions or different creatures or whatever want in it is a lot of the stuff that you might need to rely on in order to create extra encounters or extra quests is right there in the module already, right? So we already have monster stats. We already have different things that are there. You're just sort of recontextualizing it a little bit in order to have some side quests or some other little things going on. I don't necessarily strongly recommend this, but it is a way that you can spend more time in the module.
Yeah. Although again, I think you mentioned earlier picking up on things that the players mention or things their characters do. This is probably where you should do that. Reincorporate their interests into the side quests if possible. But it's a bit improv-y. That's what you should be doing in the halftime coffee break while everyone else is away, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
My last bit of advice here is probably my favorite. A simple thing you can do to make a, one-page dungeon feel more lived in and more real and more weighty, or to just take up some time, is put a village on the front end. You've already kind of hinted at this, but the classic setup for a lot of adventure modules is there is a village and they have some kind of problem, and that problem is why you're going to the dungeon. But more and more, especially like in a world where people are making dungeons for contests, or they're making dungeons, they're not like for like full publication or whatever, or like, for like, full formal publication. They're just kind of putting out stuff. You run into like situations where there isn't a lot of that extra context. There isn't a lot of that extra setting wrapped around the dungeon. And this is just an easy way of doing that. And you can just look at an existing adventure and the way that they incorporate a village problem and just do that for your dungeon. Like you can just like come up with a little village issue and have that be an important part of the story. Now, I will say that you have to be a little careful here, because you can run into a situation kind of like you hinted at earlier, Tom, where it's a little unclear, like, when does the village end? Like,
are we doing the adventure now?
When are we done with this? Yeah. Right. Like, so you have to be mindful of that. Trophy Gold actually aligns this really beautifully because of the whole set goal thing. The set goal tells the players what they're trying to accomplish. And so once they're done with that, they can leave the village. I think you also have to be very mindful of keeping the interest level fairly high. This is where Tom and I's previous advice, listeners, about like good characterization, this is where this comes in really handy, because players always want to interact with fun NPCs. They don't want to interact with boring NPCs. And so if you can characterize the NPCs in this village to be like really genuinely like interesting, fun characters, they're going to want to stay there and do that.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind, of course, you do have to move them on, move them along at some point. But
maybe you need to make them more boring as time goes by.
Exactly. It's just a way to sort of flesh out the world a little bit, flesh out the context of this dungeon, the geographical context, the cultural context, all this other stuff. I like a little bit of mystery. If you have time to come up with like a little bit of mystery for your village, you can do that too, just to sort of, and find a way of tying it into the dungeon a little bit. That's another fun thing you can do to sort of add a little bit of meat to the bone.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be too complex, just like there's, one slightly weird boy that lives in the village and he's been going up to the mound because he's getting psychic emanations from rolling calf and like people see him go.
Right, exactly, yeah. You can have that weird little boy be like, I saw a cow skull with flaming red eyes, and it told me XYZ. And the players don't know what the fuck any of that means, but like they're going to learn it later, right? And it's going to be really cool when they do. So
it's just funny. I like this advice because it's eminently practical, and yet it reminds me of there was these many years ago, the mostly satirical RPG webzine Critical Miss had an article. I can't remember which issue. Sorry, listeners. Called How to Run an Entire Session with Zero Prep, and the advice was basically have the PCs be in a village and say, oh, before you get going, do you want to buy some equipment? There's a shop here. And they'll go, oh, yeah, sure. And then you let them go in the store and they say, so what does it have? And you say, and this is important, oh, pretty much anything in the rulebook, I guess. And then go make yourself some snacks while they spend 2 hours shopping.
That's horrible. Oh, my God. Listeners, that is not how you flesh out a session.
I mean, no, don't do that. But maybe sometimes.
Anything else you want to add to this little conversation about expanding the footprint of a small dungeon?
I do a little bit. So these have all been kind of concrete steps to do, but I think there's also we sometimes talk about putting on a point of view and looking at modules and so on. And to quote from the magnificent Apocalypse World, I think that it's a good idea to look at the NPCs through crosshairs and also the situation. So in other words, a lot of the time, one of the problems that we have with setting books or adventures is they're very static, like it's like a Star Trek episode. Everything goes back to normal at the end. And actually in the Bruja, the Beast and the Barrow, it's already set up to self-destruct from pretty much the moment you arrive. So you don't really need to do this. Like if you resist the urge to protect the status quo, and like, if you're given a chance to have Marble Eyes run over by a car, because this is set in the 50s now for some reason, to kill off an NPC that your instinct is to protect, then you should do that, because the vacuum that creates will lead to expanded content. The players will find things to do for themselves, and then you just need to respond. You won't need to plan as much.
Absolutely.
Because that kind of lack of balance creates... Does this make sense? You sort of fall forwards into the next thing, don't you?
Absolutely. A total Apocalypse World gameplay philosophy, right? Well, with all that said, let's go to the next segment. All right, it's the Companion Adventures. For reasons I'm not going to go into on the recording, I don't have much this week. Tom, why don't you start?
All right, so I'm now looking at my first one, and I'm thinking, this is a film that does not need to be recommended to players of D&D. Nonetheless, it's Conan the Barbarian, 1982. The reason for that is I keep thinking about that sort of the above-ground segment of Pickbone Mound, and I think of the dusty, windswept, desolate landscapes. And do they go to some ancient ruins at some point?
They do.
When they're having an axe fight, and where the witch lives earlier on in the film. All that stuff feels to me very, very much like where Marble-Eyes lives.
Well, and also just like the sort of like muscular, bull-headed demon
that's
thing,
true,
right?
Actually,
that's very fucking Conan, right? It's a great choice. You're right. I mean, I don't think we have to recommend that to anybody, but a good choice. What else do you have?
All right, slightly more off the beaten path. I have an interactive website about tombs, which is, it's this pretty cool website that's an archaeological project of the Valley of the Kings called the ThebanMappingProject.com. It gives you a top-down photo of the valley with all the tombs marked, and you click on one, and it shows you isometric plans of them or side views and photos of things inside it. It's really cool, and it's tomby. So, I think you should check it out.
Awesome.
Shall I just do my last thing?
Yeah, do your last thing. Go for it.
My last one is an RPG that, again, probably needs no recommendation to OSR fans at this point. Nevertheless, just in case you haven't already seen, I believe it's pronounced Mörkborg, but given that their main Discord forum is called General Morky Borky, I think they're not too fussed about how you pronounce it.
Probably not.
And this is this sort of, doom metal aesthetic, ultra grimdark OSR game, and I particularly recommend the free dungeon generator that's on their website, morkborg.com, and it creates these very short kind of four or five chamber dungeons with a little bit of backstory, and it's all metal as all get out, as you can imagine. So definitely worth a look. It has some really just great ideas for imagery, and of course combined at random in a sort of cut-ups or Jackson Pollock modern art way. So sometimes you get these really amazing combinations, and sometimes it doesn't really work and you hit refresh. So
nice. I'm actually running a Morkborg dungeon today, in fact.
Excellent.
This very day, Death Ziggurat, which I suspect will report back on listeners at some point.
Terrific.
The thing I'm going to recommend is my YouTube playthrough of the Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow. So I don't frequently have YouTube videos available for my runs of these OSR modules because I usually either play them with my bubble group, or in the before times it was just my home group that I kind of did my OSR stuff with. And so there are not, or I just wasn't recording the YouTube, right? Or I wasn't recording the online play. But I've decided to actually this year, I'm going to record all of my online OSR module runs so that listeners of the show and anybody else can go and actually watch them. And I'm going to recommend my playthrough of the Bruja, the Beast, and the Barrow for a couple of reasons. One, it was really good. The players did a fabulous job. It was just a really enjoyable session. But also, it's a really good example of how to use trophy gold for a more classic or OSR style module. I think that's something a lot of people have questions about. And so I don't think you're going to get a better example than this, frankly. It's just a great, sort of way of showing it, particularly because this dungeon is so compact and we can do it in one sitting. It's a great way of seeing the full arc of gameplay and kind of how it all comes together. So I just, I definitely recommend that YouTube playthrough. I think you can watch the whole thing in like 2 hours and 45 minutes, something like that. You put it on the background and it'll be great.
Cool.
And listeners, that is our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. If you'd like to support Fear of a Black Dragon financially, we love that. It's on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/gauntlet. And that's all I've got. Tom, thank you so much.
Jason, thank you. And thanks to our exemplary editor, Rich Rogers.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.
Bye for now, listeners.
Hi, this is Lowell. manager for the Gauntlet gaming community. I want to tell you that we have a Gauntlet Community Open Gaming event coming up the weekend of February 25th through the 28th. This is a free online RPG mini-con aimed at getting new players acclimated to online play, showing off awesome story, OSR, and indie games, and also introducing folks to how we run games on the Gauntlet. Signups will open February 1st at noon Eastern. Even if an event's filled, we have wait lists, and signing up for those is a good way to show game facilitators what RPGs are in demand. You can find all the details and links at gauntlet-rpg.com/gauntlet-community-open-gaming. There you'll find a link to the online registration calendar. Most sessions run 3 to 4 hours, and we have scheduled breaks between blocks. We're still adding events as of this recording. All sessions follow our Gauntlet Code of Conduct, which includes the mandatory presentation and use of safety tools by game facilitators. We hope you'll check out this community-created event. It's free, and anyone can play. You don't have to be a Patreon supporter or community member. Thanks so much.